Commander Thalrex stood in the center of his command ship watching the glowing displays that surrounded him. His 6 arms moved across the control panels with practiced ease while his 4 eyes tracked multiple data streams at once. The Vorthak had been the dominant force in this region of space for over 200 years, and Thalrex had never lost a battle in his 30-year career. The detection alert came through his ship's systems like every other routine scan. A small vessel had appeared on the edge of their sensor range near the 4th planet of this system. The computer identified it as human design based on its energy signature and hull composition. Thalrex felt his mandibles click together in what his species considered amusement. Humans were still new to space travel compared to the ancient Vorthak Empire. Their technology seemed primitive, and their ships were tiny compared to the massive battle cruisers that made up his fleet. Intelligence reports suggested they were explorers and traders more than warriors. This would be an easy capture. The human ship appeared to be conducting some kind of scanning operation around the planet, where the Vorthak had established a forward military base. Thalrex assumed they were gathering information about Vorthak defensive positions. Such boldness from such a small species was almost insulting. He opened a communication channel to his sub-commanders. 3 full battle squadrons would be more than enough to surround and capture this single human vessel. The Vorthak way of war was overwhelming force applied with precision and discipline. 43 warships against 1 tiny scout ship would demonstrate the futility of human resistance. Meanwhile, aboard the human reconnaissance ship Silent Arrow, Corporal Dong Ho was reviewing the day's mission parameters with his small team. The ship was barely large enough to house its 4 crew members comfortably, but it was packed with the most advanced scanning and stealth technology that human engineering could produce. Sergeant Mi Young sat at the communication station running through radio frequencies and data streams. Her job was to monitor all forms of electronic communication in the area and gather intelligence about enemy movements and capabilities. She had already identified several Vorthak military channels and was working on breaking their encryption. Code's Private Taemin operated the ship's electronic warfare systems from his position near the engine room. His equipment could jam enemy sensors, disrupt their communications, and even take control of their automated systems if he could find the right access points. He was currently mapping the defensive satellites around the nearby planet Private. So Jin handled the ship's limited weapon systems and maintained their equipment. She had originally trained as a military engineer before joining reconnaissance units. Her real talent was finding ways to make their small ship punch far above its weight class in any kind of conflict. The Silent Arrow had been conducting routine intelligence gathering for 3 days without incident. Their mission was to assess Vorthak military strength in this border system and report back to Human Fleet Command. It was exactly the kind of work that reconnaissance units did all along the frontier between human and alien space. Dong Ho had led dozens of similar missions over the past 5 years. The key to successful reconnaissance was staying invisible, gathering information quickly, and getting out before the enemy knew you were there. His team had developed an almost supernatural ability to slip in and out of hostile territory without being detected. The first sign of trouble came when Mi Young detected massive energy signatures moving toward their position. Her screens lit up with contact markers as ship after ship appeared on their sensors. She counted over 40 vessels of various sizes, all converging on the Silent Arrow's location. Taemin's systems immediately began analyzing the approaching ships. He identified battle cruisers, destroyers, and fighter squadrons all moving in perfect formation. The electronic signatures suggested they were all Vorthak military vessels with full weapon systems. Active Sojin checked their own ship's defensive capabilities and weapon status. The Silent Arrow carried only light armaments designed for emergency situations. Against a single enemy ship they might have a chance, but against an entire fleet their weapons would be nearly useless. Dong Ho studied the tactical display and felt his stomach tighten. Somehow the Vorthak had detected their presence and were responding with enough firepower to level a small city. This was supposed to be a routine intelligence mission, but it was rapidly becoming a fight for survival. The Vorthak fleet moved into an encirclement pattern that would trap the Silent Arrow, no matter which direction they tried to flee. Thalrex was clearly planning to capture the human ship intact for interrogation and study. The alien commander probably assumed that humans would surrender when faced with such overwhelming odds. Mi Young intercepted communications between the Vorthak ships and translated their tactical discussions. The aliens were confident this would be a simple operation. They planned to disable the human ship's engines and then board it to capture the crew alive. Their tone suggested they viewed humans as barely more than primitive savages. T-Men noticed something interesting in the Vorthak ship movements. Despite their numerical advantage, they were being very cautious in their approach. Their formations were textbook examples of overwhelming force tactics, but they seemed almost afraid of getting too close to the human ship. So-Jin had been studying the alien fleet composition and realized they were dealing with frontline military units, not just border patrol vessels. The Vorthak were treating 4 humans in a tiny reconnaissance ship as if they posed a genuine threat to an entire battle fleet. Dong Ho made the decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to flee or surrender, he ordered his team to prepare for combat operations. The Vorthak expected humans to behave like every other species they had encountered. They were about to discover that humans had very different ideas about acceptable odds. The Silent Arrow's stealth systems engaged. As Timon began jamming the enemy sensor networks, Mi-Young started broadcasting false signals to confuse the Vorthak targeting systems. So-Jin armed their limited weapons and began calculating firing solutions against the nearest enemy ships. Thalrex watched from his command deck as his fleet closed the trap around the human vessel. His sensors showed the small ship was still in the center of the formation, but something felt wrong. The human ship's energy signature was fluctuating in ways that didn't match their intelligence reports about human technology. The first sign that this engagement would be different from anything in Vorthak military history came when the Silent Arrow simply vanished from their sensors. One moment, it was surrounded by 43 warships, and the next moment, it was gone. Thalrex ordered an immediate sensor sweep but found nothing. Then the first explosion lit up the darkness of space as one of his destroyers disappeared in a ball of superheated plasma. Emergency communications filled the command channels as his sub-commanders tried to understand what had happened. The destroyer had been there 1 second and was debris the next. A second explosion followed as another Vorthak ship was torn apart by some kind of projectile weapon that had appeared from nowhere. Thalrex realized with growing horror that the humans hadn't fled or surrendered. They had somehow become invisible and were hunting his fleet. The careful formations that had worked for centuries of Vorthak warfare began to break down as ship captains tried to defend against an enemy they couldn't see. Communication channels filled with confused orders and panicked reports. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. Dong Ho's team worked with calm efficiency as their ship moved through the chaos of the enemy fleet. Years of training and dozens of successful missions had prepared them for exactly this kind of impossible situation. They were going to show the Vorthak why humans had survived every challenge their hostile galaxy had thrown at them. The Silent Arrow moved through space like a ghost hunting among giants. Taman had pushed their stealth systems beyond normal limits, bending light and electromagnetic radiation around their hull in ways that made them nearly invisible to Vorthak sensors. The alien ships were firing blindly into empty space, trying to hit something they couldn't see. Mi-Young worked frantically at her communication station, intercepting and decoding Vorthak battle frequencies faster than she had ever done before. Each transmission gave her team precious information about enemy ship positions, weapon status, and most importantly, the growing panic spreading through the alien fleet. The Vorthak commanders were shouting orders in their clicking language, but their disciplined formations were falling apart. Ships that had maintained perfect spacing for the approach were now bunching together defensively or spreading out randomly as each captain tried to protect his own vessel. So-Jin had transformed their tiny weapons bay into something far more dangerous than its original designers had intended. Using spare parts from their life support systems and navigation equipment, she had jury-rigged additional torpedo launchers that could fire modified mining charges with devastating accuracy. Dong Ho piloted the Silent Arrow through maneuvers that should have torn their small ship apart under the stress. He pushed their engines past safety limits and used gravitational fields from nearby asteroids to slingshot around enemy vessels at impossible angles. His flying was part skill and part controlled madness. The fourth Vorthak ship to die never saw what killed it. Taemin had taken control of its own defensive satellites and turned them against their creators. The massive battlecruiser was torn apart by weapons it had helped install just days before. Its destruction sent shockwaves through the remaining alien fleet commander. Thalrex stood frozen at his command station as reports flooded in from his surviving ships. 7 vessels had been destroyed in less than 20 minutes by an enemy that his sensors insisted didn't exist. His carefully planned capture operation had become a nightmare of invisible death and technological impossibilities. The humans were fighting in ways that violated every principle of civilized warfare that the Vorthak understood. There were no formal challenges, no honorable single combat, no respect for superior numbers or technological advantage. They simply struck from darkness and vanished before retaliation was possible. Ma Young discovered something fascinating in the enemy communications. The Vorthak were a hierarchical species that relied on strict command structures and predetermined battle plans. When those plans failed, their entire military doctrine began to collapse. She started feeding false information into their networks to increase the confusion. The silent arrow appeared suddenly behind a group of Vorthak destroyers, fired a devastating salvo of modified torpedoes, then disappeared again before the enemy could respond. 3 more alien ships were reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas and twisted metal. The remaining destroyers scattered in panic. Taemin had found weaknesses in Vorthak computer systems that their creators never suspected existed. Human software design was chaotic and adaptive compared to alien programming, which made it almost impossible for Vorthak security systems to predict or counter. He was rewriting their tactical computers in real time. Sojin guided Dong Ho toward a cluster of enemy ships that were trying to form a defensive formation. She had calculated exactly where to place their next attack to cause maximum psychological damage to the surviving alien commanders. Fear was becoming as powerful a weapon as their actual torpedoes. The Vorthak had expected to face human technology that was primitive compared to their own advanced systems. Instead, they were fighting an enemy that seemed to break the basic laws of physics and logic. Their ships were being destroyed by weapons that shouldn't exist, and tactics that were theoretically impossible. A massive Vorthak battle cruiser attempted to ram the area where their sensors suggested the human ship might be hiding, instead of crushing their tiny enemy. The alien vessel passed harmlessly through empty space while the silent arrow materialized directly above it and destroyed its command section with surgical precision. The engagement had lasted 3 hours. When Thalrex realized his fleet was being systematically dismantled by 4 humans in a ship smaller than his own personal shuttle, half of his vessels were already destroyed, and the survivors were making increasingly desperate attempts to either flee or find something solid to shoot at. Mi Young had broken completely through the Vorthak communication networks and was now broadcasting false orders directly to their ship captains. She sent contradictory commands that caused 2 alien vessels to fire on each other, while a third group abandoned their positions to chase sensor ghosts she had created. The psychological impact was becoming as devastating as the physical destruction. Vorthak warriors who had never known defeat were discovering that all their advantages in size, numbers, and firepower meant nothing against an enemy they couldn't predict or understand. Taemin found the central command frequency that connected all the alien ships and began introducing subtle modifications to their targeting systems. Soon Vorthak vessels were aiming at empty space, while the silent arrow attacked from completely different directions. The aliens were fighting shadows while real death struck from unexpected angles. Sojin had pushed their improvised weapons beyond any reasonable design limits, but they continued to function with deadly efficiency. Each torpedo she fired was modified for the specific target and tactical situation. She was turning ammunition shortage into an advantage by making every shot count perfectly. The silent arrow had become something far more dangerous than a reconnaissance vessel. It was now a weapon of terror that struck without warning and vanished without trace. The Vorthak fleet was learning to fear the darkness between stars where death moved unseen. Dong Ho brought his ship through the wreckage of destroyed alien vessels, using the debris fields as cover for their next attack. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were hiding behind the remains of ships that had been hunting them just hours earlier. Commander Thalrex sent desperate messages to Vorthak High Command, requesting immediate reinforcements. His transmissions described the humans in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or mythological monsters. The small reconnaissance ship had become something beyond his understanding of warfare. The remaining Vorthak ships were no longer trying to capture the Silent Arrow. They were simply trying to survive long enough for help to arrive. Their perfect formations had dissolved into desperate clusters of terrified warriors who jumped at sensor shadows and fired at empty space. Ma Young intercepted Thalrex's communications with his superiors and shared the contents with her teammates. The alien commander was begging for permission to withdraw, describing human combat capabilities as unlike anything in Vorthak military history. Fear had replaced confidence in every alien transmission. The Silent Arrow struck again, destroying 2 more enemy ships that had been attempting to coordinate their defense. The attack came from an impossible angle that violated their understanding of how small ships could maneuver. Physics seemed to bend around human determination and ingenuity. As the 5th hour of combat began, Taman realized they had reduced the Vorthak fleet to less than half its original strength. 23 alien warships had been destroyed by a 4-person crew that was supposed to be conducting routine intelligence gathering. The reconnaissance mission had become a legend in the making. The asteroid belt around the 4th planet had become a 3-dimensional battlefield where conventional tactics meant nothing, and survival depended on thinking faster than death itself. Dongho had led his team into the rocky maze where their small ship's advantages in speed and maneuverability would be magnified against the massive Vorthak vessels. The remaining alien ships followed because they had no choice. Their commander Thalrex had ordered them to continue the engagement despite losing more than half his fleet. Retreat was not an option for a species that had never known defeat, and the idea that 4 humans could force the mighty Vorthak Empire to withdraw was unthinkable. Ma Young had transformed the Silent Arrow's communication array into a weapon more devastating than their torpedoes. She was broadcasting false signals that made individual asteroids appear to be human ships on Vorthak. Sensors. The confused aliens were wasting ammunition shooting at rocks while the real threat moved unseen among them. Sojin had discovered that the asteroid belt contained mineral deposits that could be harvested and weaponized using their ship's industrial fabricators. She was literally creating ammunition from the environment around them, turning space rocks into guided projectiles that struck enemy ships with the force of small meteors. Taemin had taken control of the Vorthak fleet's own defensive satellites, the very systems they had installed to protect their forward base on the planet below. Now those satellites were hunting alien ships like mechanical predators, firing on any vessel that didn't broadcast the correct human identification codes. The psychological transformation was complete. The Vorthak were no longer hunting the Silent Arrow. They were being hunted by it through a maze of asteroids that seemed to shift and change with each passing moment. Every shadow could hide death and every sensor contact could be real or imaginary. Commander Thalrex watched his tactical displays with growing despair as his remaining ships were picked apart one by one. The humans had turned the entire asteroid field into a trap that caught his vessels like insects in a web. His warriors were brave, but they were fighting an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of combat. A Vorthak destroyer tried to pursue the human ship through a narrow gap between 2 large asteroids. The Silent Arrow led it deeper into the maze, then disappeared around a spinning rock formation. When the alien ship followed, it found itself in the crossfire of 3 weaponized satellites that Taemin had repositioned during the chase. The destroyer died in a storm of energy beams that lit up the asteroid field like artificial lightning. Its wreckage added to the growing debris field that made sensor readings even more confused and unreliable. The Vorthak were fighting in an environment that seemed actively hostile to their presence. Mayung had identified the command patterns that Vorthak ships used for formation flying, and began broadcasting signals that disrupted their coordination systems. Alien vessels that had maintained perfect spacing for centuries of warfare suddenly found themselves drifting into collision courses with each other. 2 battlecruisers crashed together in a slow-motion disaster that took several minutes to complete. Their crews had time to realize what was happening, but not enough time to prevent it. The collision destroyed both ships and created a new obstacle that blocked one of the main passages through the asteroid field. Sojin had turned the Silent Arrow's mining equipment into a delivery system for improvised explosives. She was planting charges on asteroids that the Vorthak ships would pass, then detonating them at precisely the right moment to maximize damage. The asteroid field itself was becoming a weapon. The hunt continued through the rocky maze as human Ingenuity met alien desperation. Every Vorthak attempt to coordinate their remaining forces was countered by electronic warfare that turned their own systems against them. Their ships were becoming isolated targets instead of a unified fleet. Tae-min discovered that Vorthak artificial intelligence was extremely sophisticated, but also extremely predictable. Their computer systems followed logical patterns that could be anticipated and exploited. He began feeding false data into their navigation computers that led ships into carefully prepared ambush sites. A group of alien fighters attempted to swarm the Silent Arrow using tactics that had worked against every previous enemy. Instead, they found themselves chasing sensor ghosts through asteroid passages too narrow for safe flight. 3 fighters were destroyed when they crashed into rocks while pursuing targets that didn't exist. Dong-ho had learned to read the asteroid field like a 3-dimensional map where every rock and ice formation was a potential tool or weapon. He flew patterns that seemed impossible to outside observers but made perfect sense to someone who understood how to use gravity and momentum as allies. The Vorthak were discovering that human warfare was based on adaptation and innovation rather than predetermined doctrine. Every time they thought they understood what the Silent Arrow would do next, the humans changed their tactics in ways that seemed to violate military logic. Ma Young intercepted communications between the surviving alien ships and realized they were beginning to break down psychologically as well as tactically. Vorthak warriors who had spent their entire careers following orders were now making decisions based on fear rather than training. Commander Thalrex tried to rally his remaining forces for one final coordinated assault, but his ships were scattered throughout the asteroid field and his communication systems were compromised by human electronic warfare. His fleet had become a collection of individual vessels fighting separate battles against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Sojin guided a modified asteroid into the path of a Vorthak battlecruiser that was trying to retreat from the engagement. The collision looked accidental to outside observers but had been calculated with mathematical precision. The alien ship was crushed by several thousand tons of rock and ice. The remaining Vorthak vessels were now fighting for survival rather than victory. Their mission to capture the human reconnaissance ship had become a desperate attempt to escape from an asteroid field that seemed haunted by invisible death. Fear was replacing discipline throughout the alien fleet. Tae-min had created a network of compromised Vorthak systems that allowed him to monitor and manipulate enemy activities in real time. He could see what their sensors detected, alter what their computers calculated, and even influence what their crews believed was happening around them. The Silent Arrow struck again and again, appearing from unexpected directions to deliver devastating attacks before vanishing into the asteroid maze. The Vorthak were learning that size and firepower meant nothing against an enemy that refused to fight fair according to civilized standards. As the 8th hour of combat began, Mi-young realized they had reduced the mighty Vorthak fleet to fewer than 15 functional ships. The aliens who had arrived expecting easy victory were now trapped in a nightmare where their own superiority had become meaningless. The asteroid field had been transformed into a graveyard of alien ambitions where the wreckage of destroyed ships drifted among the rocks like monuments to the failure of conventional thinking. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunt was far from over. News of the engagement in the Kepler system traveled at the speed of light through quantum communication networks that connected human and alien civilizations across the galaxy. The same battle was being interpreted in completely different ways, by species that had never truly understood each other's nature. Admiral Kyung-soo received Dong-ho's routine status report while reviewing fleet deployment schedules in his office on the human frontier world of New Seoul. The report was filed under standard reconnaissance operations and described a successful intelligence-gathering mission that had encountered minor enemy resistance. The admiral read through the tactical summary with mild interest. A 4-person reconnaissance team had identified and mapped Vorthak defensive installations, gathered detailed intelligence on enemy ship designs and capabilities, and successfully extracted under fire after destroying several hostile vessels that had attempted to prevent their departure. Kyung-soo made a note to commend Corporal Dong-ho and his team for their initiative and resourcefulness. The report showed exactly the kind of professional competence he expected from human reconnaissance units operating in contested space. It was good work, but hardly exceptional by the standards of the human military. Meanwhile, emergency sessions were being convened in the highest levels of the Vorthak Empire, as Commander Thalrex's increasingly desperate reports reached alien leadership on their homeworld. The messages painted a picture of technological and tactical capabilities that seemed to violate everything the Vorthak thought they knew about human warfare. High Command reviewed the engagement reports with growing disbelief. A single human vessel had destroyed over 30 Vorthak warships, including battlecruisers that were individually larger than most human space stations. The tactical analysis suggested capabilities that bordered on the impossible Supreme Commander. Kethver called together the Empire's greatest military minds to analyze what had happened in the Kepler system. The consensus was terrifying in its implications. If this was what human reconnaissance units could accomplish, what would happen? When the Vorthak faced a full human battle, fleet intelligence analysts began frantically reviewing every previous encounter with human forces. Incidents that had been dismissed as minor border skirmishes were re-examined with new understanding. The humans hadn't been avoiding major conflicts because they were weak. They had been showing restraint. The cultural shock was even more devastating than the military implications. Vorthak society was built on the principle of ordered hierarchy, where superior force always defeated inferior numbers. The humans had demonstrated that chaos and adaptation could overcome any advantage in size or technology. Back in the Kepler system, the Silent Arrow continued its mission with calm professionalism, while the surviving Vorthak ships huddled together in defensive formations that provided psychological comfort, but no real protection. Dongho's team was gathering final intelligence readings before their scheduled extraction. Mi Young had expanded her electronic warfare beyond simple jamming to complete penetration of Vorthak military networks. She was reading their tactical manuals, studying their ship designs, and downloading strategic databases that would provide human intelligence with unprecedented insight into alien capabilities. The intercepts also revealed something unexpected. The Vorthak were not evil conquerors, but rather a deeply conservative species that valued order and predictability above all else. Their expansion into human space was driven by fear that younger races would disrupt the careful balance they had maintained for centuries. Taemin discovered that Vorthak technology was actually more advanced than human engineering in many ways, but it was also more rigid and specialized. Their systems were designed for specific functions and couldn't adapt to unexpected situations the way human equipment could be modified and repurposed. So Jen realized that the aliens' greatest weakness wasn't their technology but their mindset. They approached warfare like a formal dance with predetermined steps and predictable outcomes. Humans fought like survival was more important than dignity, which made them incomprehensible to Vorthak thinking. The psychological impact of the engagement was spreading through both civilizations, but in opposite directions. Humans were treating it as confirmation that their training and equipment were effective. Aliens were treating it as evidence that humans were an existential threat to galactic civilization. Admiral Kyung-soo authorized a diplomatic mission to make contact with Vorthak leadership and discuss peaceful resolution of territorial disputes. He assumed that after demonstrating human defensive capabilities, the aliens would be interested in negotiating rather than continuing military confrontation at the same time. The Vorthak Empire was mobilizing every available warship for what they believed would be a desperate fight for survival against humanity's terrifying military machine. Their entire understanding of human nature had been shattered by the events in the Kepler system. The communication networks between star systems carried wildly different versions of the same story. Human reports described a successful reconnaissance mission that had gathered valuable intelligence despite enemy interference. Vorthak reports described a catastrophic defeat that revealed the true horror of human warfare. Cultural anthropologists on both sides struggled to explain why the same species could be simultaneously described as peaceful explorers and unstoppable killing machines. The answer lay in perspective and expectations rather than actual human behavior. Commander Thalrex, still trapped in the asteroid field with the remnants of his once mighty fleet, sent final transmissions to his superiors describing humans as unlike any enemy the Vorthak had ever faced. They fought without honor but with devastating effectiveness, turning every disadvantage into a weapon. The aliens couldn't understand that humans saw survival as the highest honor and victory as the only rule that mattered in combat. Concepts Like fair fighting and proportional response were luxuries that evolution had never allowed humanity to develop. Mi Young intercepted Vorthak communications with their home fleet and realized the full scope of their misunderstanding. The aliens were preparing for invasion by what they believed was a warrior race whose weakest scouts could destroy entire battle groups. The irony was lost on the Vorthak leadership. They were mobilizing to fight a war against an enemy that didn't want to fight them. Based on evidence of capabilities that humans considered routine rather than exceptional, as extraction time approached, Dong Ho's team completed their intelligence gathering and prepared to return to human space with information that would reshape diplomatic and military strategies for both species. They had no idea that their routine mission had already changed the balance of power in the galaxy. The Silent Arrow had become something more than a reconnaissance vessel during those hours in the asteroid field. It had become proof that human determination and ingenuity could overcome any odds, no matter how impossible they appeared to outside observers. Admiral Kyung-soo closed the mission report and moved on to other administrative duties, unaware that his routine approval of a reconnaissance operation had just triggered the largest military mobilization in Vorthak history and fundamentally altered the relationship between two galactic civilizations. Captain Jae-won brought the destroyer Busan's Pride into the Kepler system, expecting to conduct a routine extraction of a reconnaissance team that had requested pickup after completing their intelligence mission. His ship was a standard patrol vessel with moderate armaments and a crew trained for border security, rather than major combat operations. The scene that greeted him defied every expectation of what a simple extraction should look like. The space around the fourth planet was filled with debris fields that his sensors identified as the remains of over 30 Vorthak warships. Twisted metal and frozen atmosphere created a graveyard that stretched across several thousand kilometers. Few surviving alien vessels immediately fled at maximum acceleration when they detected the destroyer's arrival, broadcasting what appeared to be warnings about the terrible human war machine that had destroyed their fleet. Their transmissions were filled with references to unstoppable weapons and impossible tactics. Jae-won studied the tactical displays with growing confusion. According to his intelligence briefings, the reconnaissance team consisted of 4 personnel in a light scout ship armed with basic defensive systems. The wreckage around him suggested a major fleet engagement involving weapons that his ship didn't even carry. The Silent Arrow approached the Busan's Pride with its stealth system still active, materializing from empty space like a ghost returning from successful haunting. Jae-won had worked with reconnaissance teams before, but he had never seen one emerge from what looked like the aftermath of a major battle. Dong Ho brought his team aboard the destroyer for debriefing with the casual professionalism of soldiers completing another day's work. They showed no signs of stress or unusual excitement, despite having apparently fought their way through an entire Vorthak battle fleet over the past 12 hours. Captain Jae-won reviewed their mission report while the team cleaned their equipment and prepared written summaries of their intelligence findings. From the human perspective, this had been a textbook reconnaissance operation with all primary objectives achieved and valuable intelligence gathered. The report described standard procedures for intelligence collection, defensive maneuvering when detected by enemy forces, and tactical engagement when withdrawal was not possible. Every action was described in clinical military language that made destroying 30 alien warships sound like routine paperwork. Ma Young's communication logs showed systematic penetration of enemy networks, successful electronic warfare against hostile systems, and complete mapping of Vorthak command structures. Her work would provide human intelligence agencies with unprecedented insight into alien military capabilities and strategic thinking. Taiman's technical analysis revealed weaknesses in Vorthak computer systems that could be exploited in future encounters, detailed specifications of their weapons and defensive systems, and complete tactical doctrine that explained how they approached warfare as a formal exercise rather than desperate survival. Sojin's weapons report documented the successful improvisation of enhanced armaments using available materials and the tactical effectiveness of environmental weaponization. Her engineering log showed how standard reconnaissance equipment could be modified for combat operations when necessary. Dong Ho's command summary treated the entire engagement as a successful completion of assigned mission parameters under adverse conditions. His tactical decisions were presented as logical responses to enemy actions, rather than impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Captain J1 realized he was reading about the same engagement that had terrified the Vorthak leadership into mobilizing their entire military. The difference was perspective and cultural understanding rather than actual events. The humans had done exactly what they were trained to do when faced with enemy forces. They had used their equipment creatively, fought intelligently rather than fairly, and refused to surrender regardless of odds. These were considered basic military virtues in human culture. Meanwhile, intercepted Vorthak communications revealed a completely different interpretation of the same events. The aliens described the engagement in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or encounters with forces beyond rational understanding. The Vorthak military was preparing for what they believed would be humanity's inevitable invasion of their territory. Every available warship was being recalled to defend their core worlds against an enemy whose scouts could destroy entire fleets. Supreme Commander Kethvar had declared a state of emergency throughout the Vorthak Empire, based on the assumption that humans were a warrior race whose exploration activities were actually advanced reconnaissance for military conquest. The cultural misunderstanding was complete and potentially catastrophic. Humans were planning diplomatic contact to resolve territorial disputes peacefully, while Vorthak were preparing for a war of survival against what they perceived as an unstoppable military threat. Admiral Kyung-soo received the extraction report, and Captain Jaewon's observations about alien fleet movements with interest but no alarm. The successful reconnaissance mission had provided valuable intelligence while demonstrating human defensive capabilities to potential adversaries. The Admiral authorized increased diplomatic efforts to establish communication with Vorthak leadership and negotiate peaceful resolution of border incidents. He assumed that after seeing human military effectiveness, the aliens would prefer negotiation to continued confrontation. At the same time, Vorthak intelligence was analyzing every aspect of the engagement and reaching conclusions that would reshape their entire strategic thinking. If human reconnaissance teams were this dangerous, their actual military forces must be beyond imagination. The terrible truth was that both species were preparing for the wrong conflict based on fundamental misunderstanding of each other's nature and intentions. Humans expected rational negotiation, while Vorthak prepared for existential warfare. Captain Jae-won filed his mission report and returned to routine patrol duties, unaware that his simple extraction operation had been interpreted by alien observers as proof of humanity's vast military superiority and aggressive intentions toward galactic civilization. Dong-ho and his team received commendations for successful mission completion and were assigned to their next reconnaissance operation with no recognition that they had fundamentally altered the balance of power between species. The Silent Arrow was refueled and resupplied for its next intelligence-gathering mission, while Vorthak propaganda networks broadcast warnings about human superweapons and the need for immediate military mobilization to defend against inevitable invasion. Mi Young's intelligence reports were filed in standard databases where they would be analyzed by diplomatic specialists, preparing for peaceful negotiations, with an alien species that was simultaneously preparing for desperate warfare against human aggression. The engagement in the Kepler system had ended, but its consequences were just beginning to ripple through galactic civilization. Two species were approaching each other with completely opposite expectations, based on the same set of events. As the Busan's Pride departed the debris field that had once been a Vorthak battle fleet, Captain Jae-won asked Dong-ho if the mission had presented any unusual challenges that might affect future reconnaissance operations in the area. Dong-ho considered the question while reviewing the tactical logs one final time. His team had successfully completed their assigned mission, gathered valuable intelligence, and returned safely despite enemy interference. By human military standards, it had been exactly what reconnaissance units were trained to accomplish. "Not really, sir," Dong-ho replied with the calm professionalism that had carried him through dozens of similar missions. "Just another day at the office." He had no idea that his routine competence had just convinced an entire alien empire that humanity was the most dangerous military force in the galaxy.